Hello and welcome back to the long-belated third installment of the Peter Gabriel era Genesis reviews. Today I will be talking about Foxtrot, in a lot of respects the album where they really come into their own. I think maybe the best overall Genesis album. Maybe that's a hot take, maybe that's not, probably not, I don't know. This album was recorded by the same lineup as Nursery Crime. It's a lineup that will carry through for the next two albums, and then for two more albums after that instrumentally. And for the most part, the sessions were relatively productive and without incident. I believe they changed producers once, but otherwise it was a relatively smooth process, and the completed album, I think, reflects that. It is very even. It features contributions from basically all the members of the band. It is, to put it very simply, the most quintessential Genesis album. If it's not the best, it's at the very least my favorite. It has two or three of their absolute best songs on it, and a lot of very, very strong stuff as well. I think there is maybe an argument to be made that it has some B-side-ish tracks like the previous album, but I personally don't see them that way. Anyway, as always, let's talk about the tracks. So when you put this album on, the very first thing you hear is massive mellotron chords. It's one of the most iconic openings of any prog album, or really any rock album in general. It's a very strong introduction to a track that has a very marked sci-fi theme about the titular watcher, an alien being descending on a dead Earth, pondering the fate of its inhabitants. Very heavily influenced by Arthur C. Clarke's 1953 sci-fi novel, Childhood's End. And also, apparently to a lesser extent, by Marvel Comics. I'm not sure if I've ever mentioned Childhood's End on this channel, but if I haven't, I really probably should have, because it's an incredibly influential novel on the next 25 years of sci-fi, and especially on sci-fi tinged prog lyrics. Because to spoil the ending of the book, for those of you who intend to read it, skip ahead maybe 30 seconds to a minute. The ending of Childhood's End is that humanity melds into a massive psychic consciousness and ascends basically into godhood, leaving a dead Earth and watching aliens behind. Many bands have written tracks based on that idea. The one that jumps to mind the most at the moment is probably The Icon by Todd Rundgren's Utopia, but there were a lot of others. It's a very popular idea in this time period. Timetable is a very strong track about, well, the passage of time, as expressed via the metaphor of an old oak table from the Middle Ages. It's the sort of thing that Genesis didn't actually write about that much, but that popular memory of what Genesis were and what prog was generally has sort of conflated. It's interesting because it's a good track, it's a very strong track, I think it's a musically quite interesting track, but it's also not actually that typical of Genesis. Honestly, in its way, much less typical of them than the next track on the album. Get 'Em Out by Friday is the second longest track on the album, a progressive rock epic that embodies what I like to consider sort of the two forgotten themes of Peter Gabriel Genesis. That is to say, science fiction and the seedier underbelly, shall we say, of life in the UK. Lyrical conceit of this track is inspired by private landlords predating on their tenants in the 60s. And on the next album after this, we have another very long track that is explicitly inspired by London gangland narratives and the exploits of the Cray twins, again in the 60s. This and the next track are both sort of Hackett showcases in their own way. Both were, for the most part, written by him. This one, less so. Horizons, more so. We'll get to that when we get to that. It's a track that I guess some people don't really like, but I've always really loved this. It's kind of partially because it appeals a little bit to the history nerd in me, because lyrically It's about King Knut of England, Denmark, and Norway, who, according to popular legend, commanded the sea to stop, not commanded the tide to stop. The tide, of course, did not stop, and according to the legend, he never wore his crown again for the remainder of his life. That doesn't sound particularly believable to me, but, you know, it's the Middle Ages. We gotta go with it. Anyway, instrumentally, this is another very strong track. It has two parts. I used to very strongly prefer the first sort of acoustic-y, slightly pastoral bit, and not so much the second half of the track, which is a much bigger sound, you know, very prominent mellotron, almost kind of a funky bass sound with some really nifty Hackett guitars. But now, honestly, I think I might prefer that second half a lot of the time. So we open side 2 with Horizons, a pleasant little track. It's a very nice guitar showcase that I believe borrows something from one of Bach's shorter compositions. It's a pleasant showcase for Steve Hackett and sort of serves as the calm before the storm of what is to come next, namely pretty much the entire second half of the album. Supper's Ready is maybe the best Genesis song. If not, then the best Peter Gabriel Genesis song. It is a 23-minute epic track in the let's take a bunch of very short songs and instrumental pieces and throw them together to create sort of an overgrown medley with recurring themes format of prog epics. Thematically, it is a very loose and very modern for its era retelling of the apocalypse of St. John as described in the book of Revelations and the eventual second coming of Jesus Christ. I have to imagine that there is some influence from Jesus Christ Superstar, considering that the album came out in 1970, the play in 71, and both were very big at the time. So there has to, I would think, be some. Although, of course, as I said, it is a very loose adaptation of the story, influenced partially by, I think, some bad trips that Peter Gabriel and his wife had, and various musical bits, one of which I don't think was even supposed to be a part of Supper's Ready originally. I think the Willow Farm segment was intended to be its own song. But speaking of those snippets, let's do a brief rundown of them, shall we? So the track begins with Lover's Leap, a pleasant, if slightly menacing, pastoral, acoustic-y thing. There are many memorable lines. It seems to be about two lovers reunited after a period of time. There are some bits supposedly inspired by dodgy, hallucinogenic experiences Peter Gabriel had. And then it transitions into the next section of the track, the Guaranteed Eternal Sanctuary Man, who is a fireman who looks after the fire, and who, in the very loose sort of adaptation of Revelations that is this track, is the Antichrist. It's a very memorable section that will receive a partial reprise later on in the song. Next, we have an upbeat, energetic bit, Ichnaton and Itzikon and their band of merry men, presumably being in some way related to the New Kingdom Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, founder of the very short-lived monotheistic religion of Atenism. There's some really good Haggard guitar work throughout this section of the song. Next, there's a brief transition, How Dare I Be So Beautiful, inspired by the Greek myth of Narcissus, which then segues into Willow Farm. When I read that Willow Farm was originally intended to be a standalone piece, I was not that surprised because it feels like it. It feels like something that would have been a sort of slightly anachronistic early 70s psychedelic pop single in the same vein as I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe on the next album. Lyrically, it is about what you'd expect of an anachronistic psychedelic pop back in the early 70s. It describes a situation in which everything is in a state of flux. People and animals and objects are constantly shifting between forms, which then leads into the sixth and penultimate part of the song, Apocalypse in 9/8. Instrumentally, perhaps the highlight of the album, featuring a technique very similar to that which was employed on the title track of the 1968 Miles Davis album, Nefertiti, in which the lead guitar and bass play essentially one riff repetitively for several minutes while the keys and drums solo. It's interesting to kind of take a moment to note that I think this track specifically is the point where I first became aware when I was getting into Genesis that, hey, Phil Collins is a really, really good drummer, actually. And not in the, like, John Bonham, Dave Grohl kind of way where he makes drum patterns for rock songs that sound really, really good, but in a, wow, that sounds really hard to play kind of way. No disrespect to either John Bonham or Dave Grohl, at least when he's behind the drum kits. I'm not the biggest fan of Dave Grohl's opinions on rock music, but it's not the point. It's not the point. Anyway, the Banks soloing in this part of the song is very, very strong as well. Some of his strongest keyboard work, although again, basically all of Genesis is Tony Banks doing good keyboard work. And the albums where he's not doing good keyboard work are the bad Genesis albums. So I'm not going to mention, I'm not perhaps going to shower as much praise on him as I will, Hackett or Collins, but he's very, very good here. And that, of course, brings us to the end of the song and the album, As Sure as Eggs is Eggs, in parentheses, Aching Men's Feet. And it's a sort of reprise of the first two parts of the song. The lovers are reunited, there's an angel standing in the sun telling everybody that Christ has returned. It's like the best possible ending for a track like this, because when you make something this big, I've always felt it was important to stick the landing. That's one of the things I mentioned in my review of Pawn Hearts by Van de Graaff Generator, that, I wasn't satisfied by the ending of Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. Now, of course, now I recognize that that's kind of the point of the ending to Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, that there is no, grand resolution. It just sort of goes away. But with something like this, I think it needs that resolution, particularly when you're doing an adaptation, however loose, of the Apocalypse of St. John. You need that epicness. You need that massive emotional surge at the end, and this accomplishes that and then some. You don't need me to tell you that Foxtrot is a very, very strong album. You most likely already know that if you clicked on this video, and if you don't, well, I hope I sold you on the idea that it is. Foxtrot is an interesting album for me because it's one that I have pretty much always loved. There are Genesis albums that I've sort of gone through an arc with, ones that I started out not liking very much and that I like quite a bit today, which we'll get to if I ever revisit some of the 80s Phil Collins stuff. There are albums that I really liked at one point that I don't really like as much anymore. Again, we'll get to that if we talk about some of the Phil Collins stuff. And there's stuff that I loved then that I love now, which we're talking about while we're doing the Peter Gabriel albums, and we will talk about too if I ever revisit the Phil Collins albums. But with this album, it's interesting because it's the middle tracks. Some of the middle tracks I've liked more and I've liked less. I've pretty much always loved the bookends. Watcher of the Skies and Supper's Ready have always been real favorites of mine. But I haven't always given the middle tracks the kind of due that I think they deserve. And I recognize going back through that they're very, very strong and that they're substantially better than the shorter tracks on the previous album, and I would argue Trespass as well. And it's interesting because when I get to the next studio album I cover, there's a flip side. There's a slight flip side to it where, when I revisited Foxtrot, I realized that actually I love the stuff in the middle. But when I revisited Selling England by the Pound, I realized that actually there's maybe just a little bit too much stuff in this album. It's an amazing album, one of the masterpieces of prog, and for a really long time I think I would have said it's the best Genesis album. But anyway, I'll say more about that the next time. What I'm trying to get at is that, as I said in my shameless semi-clickbait thumbnail, I think Foxtrot is probably the best Genesis album overall. It's either this or Selling England by the Pound. I think maybe, again, we'll get to it. And don't get me wrong, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway has its hat in that ring too, but That's such a different album from basically anything else Genesis ever did that, saying it's the best or the greatest, I think it's true, but I don't know if I would go for that anyway. Anyway, certainly this is the most archetypal. All of these endings are kind of odd and to my mind never quite work the way they should, but I hope I have sold you on my enthusiasm for this album and the quality of its music. So until next time, I will see you all later.